Hey, Boss listeners. Today I'm chatting with Steve Von Till of the band Neurosis about Ted Hughes Crow from the life and songs of the Crow. We talk about Steve's new solo record, No Wilderness Deep Enough, which is being co-released with his first book of poetry, Harvestman, 23 Untitled Poems and Collected Lyrics. We also touch on Steve's love of Sylvia Plath's Ariel and how rad the San Jose State Library was, and hopefully still is. But first, let's listen to a bit of No Wilderness Deep Enough's last track, Wild Iron.
The firelight is burning low. The half moon sits behind us. Endless the days of unbroken plain. A ring of stars.
So to start, maybe like with an anecdote of my own, I was thinking about it's probably 10, 12 years ago maybe, when for the first time I was reading Sheltering Sky by Paul Bowles.
Yeah.
And came to a quote where I was like, what is this quote from? I can't figure out what this quote's from. And then a light bulb went off. I was like, oh shit, that's in Neurosis' Enemy of the Sun. And I kind of then linked it. I was like, oh, there's literary stuff happening in here. This is some cool stuff to dig into. So I guess I've always wondered how much is reading and books in general played a role in your life?
Fairly large. I started reading pretty early, and I remember going to the thrift store with my grandpa and just picking out whatever. And I was attracted to the older looking books, even if I didn't know what they were. Mm-hmm. In the children's section and the kids' books in the modern ages, they look more oriented to kids, where back in the old days, they were still nice, nicely bound with classic illustration. And so I would just kind of randomly pick stuff and read it. And my family were all readers, and all college educated. So reading was pretty big in the home. And actually, shit, did I just take it in the house? Yeah. I think the first time I was really super turned on by it was maybe a couple classics like Robinson Crusoe or stuff like that. But The Hobbit, Tolkien, just grabbed me by the soul when I was a fourth grader, actually, right about there, a fourth or fifth grader. In fact, I borrowed a book from a neighbor kid in our neighborhood, and I still have it. And I've read it out loud to my classes every year that I've taught elementary school. So I might give it back to him someday. The paper dust cover's gone. The last year, the spine finally gave way, and the book is pulling apart from the cover. But I feel like I always have to read that particular copy because that's the one that I first read. And by the time I return my borrowed book, there won't be much left of it.
Getting a good run for the money, right?
Exactly.
So if it started so early, it almost sounds like it precedes a lot of music and songwriting stuff. At what point did it start to kind of blend the two?
Yeah, that would have been probably when I joined Neurosis and was simultaneously in college, and I was really infatuated with the college library. It's kind of right when Neurosis, we moved from writing hardcore lyrics about more mundane things that teenage guys write about, and just struggling to create songs at all, let alone think about great lyrics or more meaningful. But once we decided that we wanted to embody and sound like the beginning and the end of everything, and everything in between, and the emotional backdrop, and provide the emotional backdrop for the entire human experience, and all the personal trials and tribulations as seen through the kind of existential questions. We had to blow everything up, and everything had to get crazier. And so by this point, I'm in college. I'm reading lots of Carl Jung, lots of, I got a sociology degree, was my first degree. And so there was a lot of, socialization reading, a lot of social theory. I was also really attracted to the kind of classic 60s books of the, psychedelic revolutions or the, political revolutions, the social change, rocking the boat in general. And as well as a lot of the books kind of around the early industrial scene, people were doing kind of a lot of J.G. Ballard type stuff and Timothy Leary, who wrote Cosmic Trigger, Robert Anton Wilson. So, just trying to read anything that was considered strange or counterculture, mixed with what I was getting in school. And so it kind of became a hodgepodge. I never really got stuck in a single style, I loved Dune as a teenager, but I never got stuck in sci-fi. I loved Tolkien, as I already said, but I once you get into that fantasy section, it gets pretty samey and second rate pretty quickly. And so really that San Jose State Library, I used to meet a buddy in there to study, but we never studied. We exchanged copies of Maximum Rock and Roll magazine and traded tapes of punk rock music from all over the world because there was no internet back then. And all you could do was dub rare stuff for your friends. We were both tape traders. And I remember just walking the aisles and grabbing random poetry and checking it out. That's where the title of Enemy of the Sun came from, was a book of poetry.
Okay.
Not only the books and the psychology sections, the mythology section, poetry, philosophy, and just randomly checking things out. If it looked interesting, if I cracked it open and it looked like it had interesting text that spoke to me at that time, I would check it out. It was really just a curiosity thing. And they also had rows and rows of record albums and little booths where you could go record things off the record albums. And it was like speeches, spoken word, strange experimental music. That's where I learned about things like John Cage, and the 60s kind of drone artists. I didn't know about any of that stuff. And I just kind of stumbled into a lot of it by looking for content that we could manipulate into our music, whether it was arty films for our visuals or strange recordings for blending into the sounds or words to steal into lyrics.
So that's a good kind of segue into the concept of, when you're making stuff, everybody's influenced from the things around them, things they seek out, but also they kind of absorb just natural things, right? So I guess, did you consciously have a goal in taking these specific collection of influences and creating something? Or was it a little bit more of kind of like a natural process by like osmosis?
Probably a mix of both of those things. Some of it I think was just, a young man with his mind open, throwing interesting stuff in there, to be part of the stew. But some of it was intentional, like if I was looking for things to sample or like that Paul Bowles quote, out of the Sheltering Sky movie. Well, that's Paul Bowles himself reading that quote. I believe Brandon Lee, Bruce Lee's son, has that exact quote tattooed, or not tattooed, but carved into his gravestone as well, which was unrelated. I heard about that later. It's like, wow, it's interesting.
Is that the actor that was like killed on set?
In The Crow, in the making of The Crow. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the Crow.
Right. Perfect link for the eventual topic of Ted Hughes' Crow. That was not planned. Yeah, so in terms of, I guess, because we're eventually going to kind of focus on poetry, and you have your new book of poems. We're going to talk about Ted Hughes, eventually Sylvia Plath. I'm curious, did poetry precede song lyrics, or did song lyrics come first, or do you even separate them?
I do definitely separate them because they serve two completely different purposes. I started writing lyrics in high school, just for whatever my punk rock band was at the time, just trying to come up with something because you got to have lyrics. And a lot of it was just your usual kind of, screw society kind of stuff. But poetry, I was more of a fan of it early on, but as I was beginning to write lyrics that were tackling the larger questions. My journals in which I would be practicing lyrics became journals of poetry pretty quickly, with no intent to publish, mostly just for my own sake. But I was definitely experimenting with it as a late teen, early 20s, as a form. And until now, it has all lived and died in my personal journals, with the exception of when it comes to be lyric writing time, I would go there and start mining for phrases, words, treating them like banks of places to go to, mining ore. And basically would just, it would only ever show its form in butchered pieces and lyrics. And so back to the question of how they're different for me is, lyrics have to serve a song. I know other people write songs differently, but the only way I've ever written songs in any of my projects has been music first. It's always the music pretty much completely formed before words are ever thought of. And so the way I come up with lyrics will be, part of it is just listening. What is the song calling for? What style of voice does it want? What cadence? What rhythm? What vowel sound do you want to hang on? In that scream, how many syllables can the line have? All of those things take precedence over meaning in a lot of ways. And so, the first step is listening, and what voices do you hear in the wind, trying to just decode what you might be hearing within it and what it might be saying, writing down what you can of that, and then filling in the blanks by going to the journals and looking for things that make sense or things I can rearrange. So a song lyric could be lines from 5 or 6 different poems of different times of life, different experiences I might be talking about in the poem, tied together with what was heard in the music, and then reassembled into this new thing to have a completely different life, where even though that sounds like it has the potential to be a jumbled up bag of nonsense, I've found it really does take on a very clear meaning over time. Even if I don't know what it is at the moment, it usually reveals itself later. Well, maybe I shouldn't say usually. It often reveals itself later. And when it doesn't, I'm completely fine with the mystery.
How do you feel about, Harvestman, the new book that's a collection of poems and collected lyrics, how do you feel about seeing your lyrics put next to kind of standalone poems? Because as I read through those, having heard the albums, I was actually really impressed how much those words stand alone just in their own form on the page. So if we're talking about how poetry doesn't necessarily always just map directly into lyrics, do lyrics map directly back into poetry?
I suppose so, and, it was actually that process of mining my poems for lyrics that was the impetus for the whole book. I had had about 1 week in which I wrote all the lyrics for the album, because the engineer producer I was working with, Randall Dunn, I thought I wrote an ambient record. I had no plans to sing on this new record at all. I thought it didn't need my harsh croak. Not to make another bad Crow reference there, but
we get hits based on the number of Crow references, so
all over the place. I thought it sounded good on its own, but the problem was now where does that fit? It's not Harvestman. It's not solo material. I don't know where this fits, but I know I want to take it to the next level and go to a real studio and re-record the piano and get cello and French horn on there to do the parts that I had written in the studio here. And he challenged me to sing on it. Basically, he said, no, I think you should sing on it and make it your next solo record. And so I spent 1 week, because I was on winter break from school, challenging myself to explore his claim. Because I really didn't believe it, but I respected his opinion enough to check it out. So my wife was visiting her parents in Germany. I was alone with the dogs in the house, buried in snow. Every morning, got my cup of coffee, built a fire, grabbed my notebook and my pen, stepped up to a microphone set up in the living room with a simple recording setup, and improvised. Had those poetry journals open and ready to steal from. And as I stole 2 of the lines, I think Are they the first two lines? Yeah, first two lines of the first poem. We have the sea and we will always have the sky. Well, I stole those for the song, The Old Straight Track. And I felt super guilty about stealing those two lines this time for whatever reason. I was like, I was just looking at the poem thinking, man, that was a perfect poem. Even though I don't publish my poetry, I believe that was the way it was supposed to be. And I just stole it. But that song needed those two lines. Those were the perfect two lines to end that song.
Mm-hmm.
And so that spurred me to challenge myself. I was kind of going off of that Randall voice challenge and going, okay, maybe I should sit and write a work of poetry with the intent of not butchering it for lyrics, of letting it stand on its own. And so really rather quickly after that, I had written that set of poems. And when I realized there was a kind of body of work there, in fact, they were all untitled. It was 23 of them. It was a good number. And, yeah, so that was the impetus where once I created them and it was a body of work, I thought, well, maybe I'll go to Kinko's and make chapbooks for friends or, really, but then it quickly kind of snowballed of, well, jumping into the literary world is probably way harder even than the music world as far as, trying to get a foot in anywhere, I would imagine. Mm-hmm. Everybody and their brother's a poet, more than everybody and their brother's a guitar player. And so I thought, well, maybe if I bundle it together with my lyrics and self-publish, maybe there's an audience for it. And if I put it out the same time as the record, because they're kind of connected through that process, maybe that would open an audience for my poetry of people that like my music and might take a chance on it. And it turned out so far to be a really successful experiment. And even as I was researching how to print books, I've manufactured many records and CDs over the years. But then a friend of mine who's a publisher at the University of South Dakota read it. I was just asking him for advice on where to print, and he said, "No, let me do it. I think this is really good, and you should own it and be proud of it and put it out there through a proper press." And I have, small press distribution to get it into some cool shops, and you can sell them in your mail order with your record and whatever. So I don't know. It's just kind of a perfect lesson in learning to let things happen, to not let any of my mental blocks or self-doubt or negative self-talk get in the way of what might be a good idea or dishonoring the muse in some way by canceling a potential idea, but both in listening to Randall to put my voice on the record, which created the lyrics, which created the impetus to the book, which led to, you and I sitting here talking about it now. So that's really the kind of this whole thing for me is this record and this book is I'm out there in a way that's more out of my comfort zone than I've ever been in either project. I mean, in any project I've done, but feels in many ways the most rewarding because it is kind of challenging, weakness or stepping out there.
Yeah, definitely. And the package of the two together really fits. And I've started to kind of view it a little bit as kind of like a decoder ring. I was like, oh, this is how all of these influence and things start to mix together. And then when we start to pair it with this book of poems by Ted Hughes Crow, which you pulled out as kind of like a significant influence, it's kind of like brain firing on all cylinders. You can like see where a lot of this stuff comes from. And so I guess since we've talked a lot about influences in general and how you kind of absorb them and play off of them, I'm curious, why is Crow such an enormous influence on your stuff?
Well, it's actually, even though I've been reading poetry, like I said, since I went to college, this particular bunch is fairly new to me. I had read his birthday letters book before because I've been fascinated with Plath, Sylvia Plath, since my early 20s, off and on, go back to her stuff. Honestly, like the whole, not even just the poems themselves, but the whole thing, like, I know our listeners can't see it, but I'm holding the book in my hands and the cover is perfect. The illustration, the drawing on the painting by Leonard Baskin is so incredibly appealing and just speaks to me. Well, one, I'm a sucker for anything with a crow or a raven on it. I'm already hooked. But it's just super compelling. And the hand-drawn font, I don't know if you've seen this exact version, but I mean, that hand-drawn font is even down to this strange little black mark in the corner that seems to serve no purpose other than to somehow balance the entire page. The feel of the paper, the color of the paper, the font that they chose to write the poems in, all of it is perfect. I think this is a perfect book.
Yeah, I feel almost a little bit conned because the version I bought is not the superior version you have. And then I later found out about it, and I was like, "God, fuck this up."
You can always buy another copy.
True,
trade that one in.
I almost want to. So just talking about poetry in a podcast is tricky, right? Because you can't summarize it in the way that you might summarize the arc of a novel. But I want to focus a lot on kind of the tone of this. And so to give the listener a feel for it, I'm going to read the first half of the first poem. So this is the first half of Two Legends. Black was the without eye, black the within tongue, black was the heart, black the liver, black the lungs, unable to suck in light, black the blood in its loud tunnel, black the bowels packed in furnace, black too the muscles, striving to pull out into the light, black the nerves, black the brain with its tomb divisions, black also the soul, the huge stammer of the cry that, swelling, could not pronounce its son. And I was thinking about this today as I was rereading some different poems in the collection, that to me is as powerful as some of like my favorite records' first songs. It's just like right out of the gate. And I remember picking this up because a common theme for this podcast is I like to explore different stuff that people suggest. It's cooler that way. So like I hadn't read any Ted Hughes before, and I just read that and I was like, holy shit, I'm an idiot. There's this whole world out there of this good stuff that's dark, that's impactful, that makes me feel the same way that, quote unquote, aggressive music feels. And it's by a 1970s English guy. And so the tone is just there. Right.
Yeah, it's extremely dark. It's extremely violent at times. I would say ultra violent, but with indifference. It's a hard one to take because you've got the book as a whole, which obviously there's these poems within it which are part of this Crow cycle, which are specifically talking about Crow or something directly related to the character Crow. And then there's some other ones that seem to not be part of the Crow narrative, but they go more into, I think, humanity and relationships and things like that. And those ones, to me, are almost like outliers of the central theme, because most of it just centers around this Crow, which is the perfect union of creator, destroyer, trickster. Mm-hmm. But is a creator who's also created by some greater creative force, like in a lot of indigenous religions or pre-Christian pagan religions. He's also an observer of the strangeness of the universe around him, both the cosmos and earthly things, and even subterranean things, And he's also an opportunist, as we know in the natural world crows to be. Almost his ethic is to not get bound up by human ethics. He has a purpose and he's sure of his purpose. Occasionally second guesses himself and, for a moment observes himself, but then always is like, but no, I kill to eat and I'm hungry.
Yeah, he's like a nefarious sidekick of God who sometimes seems to help, but often, like you said, like the trickster, the prankster, seems to also just be as interested in messing stuff up.
Exactly. Maybe like Loki of Norse myths or Coyote of Native American myths, very similar feeling thing.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of like the thing that resonates me, like outside of that, just like truly, truly dark, but also kind of weirdly funny tone. It is that like concept of myth and kind of like exploring this. And I know like at some level, people kind of read this, maybe it's a send up of Western religion, Christianity, But like, I think it's almost a little bit more general than that. It is like the question of, we said, like origin stories and what is like the common mythology. And so that was actually a thing that like resonated with me. And then your book of poems, which I feel like there's just that exploration, and it's almost bigger than this classic, like, well, what is the meaning of life? It's more like, what's the connection with the natural world? Like, how did this stuff actually get here? And what does that mean that for me, like as an individual?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in my own wanderings, which obviously comes out as poems or music, I'm constantly zooming out to the macro, the cosmos, the universe, the origins as we learn them to be scientifically, which in itself, thinking about is enough miracle to outdo any religion that any humans have thought of. I mean, it just the mathematical possibilities of everything becoming the way they are, to the fact that we're here talking about it, is mind-boggling and I think unknowable. But kudos to the minds that dive deep and get further than other humans do in understanding it. Personally, my only way to express my understanding of it is in vague poetry, and then zooming back into the micro, to the like a fractal of everything, like down into the personal, my personal experience, what I experience personally in life, but not wanting to bore people with my personal details, putting it into natural metaphor, and constantly all those things. What is our relationship to the universe? What's our relationship to the earth and to our planet? The mother of us all. What's our relationship to our community? What's our relationship to our loved ones and our families? And what's our relationship to our own mind and to ourselves? And how do all those things relate in that quest for meaning, quest for something real in a world full of seeming distraction? What's it like to be a thinking, feeling human being in a world full of nonsense? Just kind of all of that. And I don't have any answers, just exploring the questions constantly and very cyclically, very spirally. I've come back to those themes since those early days of trying to write lyrics about these things. I keep repeating back to the ideas of finding the natural cycles of things and finding connections and my place in them.
Yeah, I feel like you also touch on kind of the question of what language actually is. Like, how do we represent things? And I think about that kind of applied to Hughes's Crow, and how he plays with this in like so many different ways. And, I hate to just be the guy that'll say like, hey, there's layers to this. But I kept coming up with like, damn, those are like cool linguistic moves. And so like to start, I'll do another excerpt that comes from A Kill. And so the beginning of this starts with, flogged lame with legs, shot through the head with bald brains, shot blind with eyes, nailed down by his own ribs, strangled just short of his last gasp by his own windpipe, clubbed unconscious by his own heart. And that's maybe one of my favorite moments, because it's not only impressively dark, common refrain here, but it's also funny. It's also clever. Your injury is from the source of it itself.
You have a dark sense of humor.
I like to think of myself as like a positive realist. Like, maybe this is as good as it's going to get.
I have to say, shot blind with eyes alone, that line alone wins me over. I always feel drawn to the ones like, fuck, I wish I thought of that.
Yeah.
And that, so his use of language is his play with language is incredible. I thought of an example too, like when you were talking about, I think he has a poem, and I might be projecting because I've had this conversation with a lot of friends lately about just the state of our world and our society and the incredible division that people are feeling on multiple levels, and with social media thrown in and everything just stirring it up into a giant shit show. Mm-hmm. And I feel like part of it, like, we don't have the language we need to have. We do not have a language that is complex enough and subtle enough at the same time to describe our reality. And so people get stuck in these loops, which don't jive with other people's loops. Mm-hmm. And we have no way to cross that threshold and not just like winning an argument or convincing somebody of something, but for a way to everybody feel that their needs and fears are being addressed and lifted up out of the rubble of the division, of the classic divide and conquer that we all seem to volunteer to join, you know? Mm-hmm. And I feel like he kind of addresses that in that there's one poem called Crow Goes Hunting. I feel like in this poem, let me first start with a caveat. I don't think it's our place to sit and analyze poetry and to decipher the poet's meaning. I don't even know some of the time what my own poems mean exactly. And I might have a hint of what they're referring to, but a lot of it is just kind of painting an emotional tone, painting a landscape in which the reader can have their own emotional experience within and own it, like you do with music.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to take away any of the magic by over-explaining, but we are having a conversation about the book, so I'm going to do it a little bit. So it's one that you might remember is that Crow decided to try words. He imagined some words for the job, a lovely pack, clear-eyed, resounding, well-trained, with strong teeth. You could not find a better bred lot. He pointed out the hair, and away went the words, resounding. Crow was crow without fail. But what is a hair? It converted itself to a concrete bunker. The words circled, protesting, resounding. Crow turned the words into bombs. They blasted the bunker. The bits of bunker flew up, a flock of starlings. Crow turned the words into shotguns. They shot down the starlings. The falling starlings turned into a cloudburst. Crow turned the words into a reservoir, collecting the water. The water turned into an earthquake, swallowing the reservoir. The earthquake turned into a hare and leapt for the hill, having eaten Crow's words. Crow gazed after the bounding hare, speechless with admiration. I almost feel like he's telling us, even though he's a master of language, that language is not enough. Mm-hmm. Language is not enough to describe our reality.
Yeah, and that it'll be manipulated in ways that perhaps it wasn't intended to do. And that's its own.
Yeah.
You know, what's the absolute definition of what language is supposed to do? I mean, it's always morphing, it's always changing, and that's for the best, right? It's kind of evolving. But certainly, I mean, your observation about like the current climate is perfectly astute. It's just like we've created these communication channels where there's no benefit to saying something with nuance and complexity and emotion. It's all just these walls. And so you almost want there to be, like you said, like language isn't enough, but you know, is there a way that like it doesn't have to be manipulated so much? Can it get back to more of like that original, like useful nature? That the myth of language, even.
Yeah, language needs to do like what the story of the soldiers in World War I on Christmas Eve, you know,
right?
Did.
Yeah.
Language has to find a way to get people to crawl out of the trench for an evening and get through the barbed wire to have a moment of shared humanity.
Exactly. And it also makes me think, you know, kind of built into any topic about Ted Hughes. There's the Sylvia Plath side of things. You know, we were exchanging emails about whether we should read Crow or whether we should read Ariel. And so I'm kind of curious, you know, I don't want to be the person who kind of wades into a very large topic of a relationship between artists. I'm more so interested in, you know, the poems themselves. You know,
for sure.
What do you see in the Plath, you know, works? Because I believe you've mentioned before that your new record is pulled from a Plath poem itself.
Completely out of context. So I was
You're manipulating those words.
I was manipulating the words.
There it is.
Hopefully for the betterment of my record. The poem in which I stole the album title, No Wilderness Deep Enough, was a manipulation of this line from a poem called The Thin People in 1957. And it has nothing to do with how I think the title represents the songs on the record. The line is, it's kind of coming off all these images of seemingly images of poverty, starvation, with very human vignettes into the kind of suffering. But the line is, we own no wilderness rich and deep enough for stronghold against their stiff battalions. So really, I just saw those words and I just instantly went, that's No Wilderness Deep Enough is the title. That has to be the title. Because that seems to summarize exactly. I say the word exactly, even though what I really mean is vaguely and metaphorically. That summarize very vaguely and metaphorically what I'm also very vaguely and metaphorically trying to say on the record. Let me be more precise with my language. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we can't just get into this, complaint about language not being accurate enough, and then we misuse it ourselves. It just gets ahead of us.
It's constant battle.
Yeah, I kind of went down a Plath reading hole in this too, and I was impressed. And again, I mean, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but a lot of her stuff very dark, very coarse in a way. But the difference was that I found it was sort of very emotionally deep, very psychologically deep, and it was really kind of an opening up of these things that didn't really fit with a lot of her earlier works. And so I was impressed at, taking the two together and like looking at one as kind of this exploration of almost, man itself or the origin stories, and that would be Hughes's Crow. And then Plath's Ariel seemed almost like a deep dive into herself and kind of like the emotional capacity of it.
Absolutely.
They're almost different sides of the same coin, but like, outside of the super awesome language that you pulled, what's the stuff that you get out of it?
Out of Plath's?
Yeah.
I think that same thing, that just emotional depth. I mean, especially you think of female writers at that time, it probably wasn't easy to write that openly about sanity, mental health, your social standing, relationships, perhaps, I don't want to read too much in it, perhaps domination and abuse. But again, it's more her word choice, her way of describing it is the same thing like what you said of like, I can't believe there's this stuff out there that's been around for all, since before I was born, that's as intense as the intense records I like to listen to, and if you were a, avid poetry reader back at that time, cracking that copy of Ariel must have been like putting on Black Flag's My War, like just like a game changer. Holy shit. It's all up in the air now. And so I just like that way in which she uses that intense language. It's she doesn't lean on the nature metaphors like Hughes does in the same way. I think she almost exclusively uses them to describe the internal world, like you were saying, which I appreciate a lot, as I think I do the same thing. I like to hide in metaphor, but somehow she also is also very bare and open and out there as well, simultaneously. Like she'll mix the metaphor with the reality. Yeah,
that was the thing that definitely stood out, was that mixture of, I feel like, especially like in fiction, any like first person narrator or like autobiographical fiction kind of runs the risk of being too focused on the individual, right? And I gravitate a little bit more towards, not to say like bigger questions, but like what are the systems, what are the down forces on an individual? How do these things manipulate people? What's the psychological impact? So I was impressed that she really, like you said, both put herself out on the line, but then gave it enough of, a poetic language to allow the reader to find themselves in it. Not that anybody's work or poetry is designed to be something that the reader puts themselves into, but more so that it's accessible, that you can find something in it to confide in. And I think at that time, like you mentioned, it was not a time to be writing about mental illness. It was not a time for a woman to be talking about these things, at least in terms of ease of publishing and stuff like that. And so I just feel like that's more punk rock than a lot of the stuff I like. And you're right. It's absolutely just total game changer.
So in talking about the way that both of them use nature metaphor, which obviously I'm extremely inspired, indebted, and utilize myself. One thing as I was rereading Crow for this talk, in the way that most nature-based poetry speaks about it, it tends to concentrate more on the majesty and the beauty, maybe the all-encompassing, nature is so much bigger than humanity. but he straight up says nature is a horror. And the horror of creation, I think he says at one point. How basically the feelings from a lot of those poems is how helpless we are in the face of it and our understanding of how and why it all works, breaking it down to where it seems like compared to within this natural world, trying to have an ethical view of anything is completely meaningless because violence is just something that exists and is completely normal and looked upon by the universe itself with complete indifference.
Yeah, it's total like Cormac McCarthy, Blood Meridian vibes.
Minus a creepy judge. But
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great like observation, right? It's just, I think that's one of the things that stands out about this to me as well, is like, you know, a lot of people, especially I think maybe listeners, find a divide between music and poetry and often associate poetry with being this lighter thing and music maybe being coarser, more aggressive. And it's just not like that.
And like you keep going back to like your favorite punk rock or intense records, right? Like what's more nihilistic than some of the attitudes found in this book? You know, the meaningless of it all. It's almost like the importance with which humanity is given itself is completely broken down in this. You know, it's very, very nihilistic, very anti-humanist, you know, I think in a lot of ways.
Yeah, if you strip us back to the animals that we actually are, it gets real bleak real fast.
Word.
So yeah, I guess I just have to say that this was, like I said, it's almost a decoder ring for like getting into, like I said, your poetry, solo works, Neurosis stuff. Like all these things to me are really connected. So I just have to say for a listener, like you should definitely be grabbing Hughes and Plath poetry and sitting down with some records, because this stuff really fills it out. And if you haven't given it a chance, like this, it's more punk rock than punk rock. So I appreciate the time, you know, chatting on this Friday. And
thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, this has been a total pleasure. So thank you. Thanks for listening. You can find out more about Steve Von Til at vontil.org. That's VONTILL.org. No Wilderness Deep Enough is available today from Neurot Records. Harvestman, 23 Untitled Poems and Collected Lyrics is available from Astrophil Press. And if you check out all of these things and still have the energy, you can find Boss at booksofsomesubstance.com and on Twitter and Instagram at booksosubstance. To close, here is Steve Von Til reading Untitled Poem number 19 from Harvestman. Enjoy.
A furious alchemy it is, these words. Though often logical enough, the consequences remain clear. I am not speaking of cryptic parchments or barely discernible manuscripts, but of language itself. It simultaneously liberates, betrays, preserves, and destroys, heals, and infects, all while placing us all in harm's way, in constant danger of misunderstanding.